Good morning. My name is Kathy Henry, and I'm your worship associate for today. Our sermon today will be given to us by Star Austin, and Star is a credentialed religious educator, certified OWL teacher with the UUA, and lay preacher. She comes from a long line of women preachers. She has been a UU for 21 years and is invested in the growth and transformation of our religious communities, including our own, who she has been working with for the last few months. Okay. Our prelude is number 155, Circle Round for Freedom.
Thank you. Good morning. We light this chalice for all who are here and all who are not,
and all who are farting,
for all who have ever walked through our doors, for those who may yet find this spiritual home, and for those we can't even yet imagine. For each of us and for us all, may this flame burn warm and bright.
And we'll start with the opening hymn, hymn number 188, Come, Come, Whoever You Are.
Though you've broken your vows 1,000 times, though you've broken your vows 1,000 times, though you've broken your vows 1,000 times, come yet again, come. Though you've broken your vows 1,000 times, though you've broken your vows 1,000 times, broken your vows 1,000 times, come yet again, come. Though you've broken your vows 1,000 times, you've broken your vows 1,000 times, you've broken your vows 1,000 times, come yet again, come. Though you've broken your vows 1,000 times, though you've broken your vows 1,000 times, you've broken your vows 1,000 times, come yet again, come yet again, come.
Good morning. You know, when I think about transformation, like many of you, I often think of the image of a butterfly. Pretty basic little caterpillar goes into a cocoon, wrapping himself in the silk bud, and emerges with glorious wings, flying around for us to all enjoy. It's an image that we remind each other of when things get tough. We gladly pass this on to our children, that transformation will happen and you'll be flying around like a butterfly. Now, I've always taken this for granted, that the transformation kind of turned into this image that was a bit of a cliche, losing its taste and its sting in the process. We use the symbol, but we don't think about what it means anymore. Fortunately, years ago, I read Soulcraft, a book on personal transformation, and it talks about this butterfly, and it talks about what happens in that chrysalis when the caterpillar goes in and wraps himself inside. Now, I always thought if you cracked open a chrysalis, it would look something like teenagers, gangly limbs, maybe they're bumping into the walls, they're not quite sure where they're at in the world just yet. And if you're a teenager listening to this, I hope that you don't feel called out, but that you feel seen, that it's an awkward time, that things are changing rapidly, and sometimes we can't quite find our physical place in the world. I thought that that's what the caterpillar would look like, that somehow its body would have evolved, it would have become thinner, elongated, that somehow the wings would start growing out. Well, it turns out that's not what happens at all. If you were to open a chrysalis halfway through its nympha stage, the capsule would not be some kind of hybrid creature, half caterpillar, half butterfly. It would be a puddle of goo, of liquid. In order to become a butterfly, the caterpillar has to fall apart completely, decompose down to its very essence, devoid of any shape or consciousness. It literally dies. There's nothing left of it. And from this liquid essence, the butterfly starts to put itself together again from scratch. This seems pretty miraculous, almost like the resurrection story that we heard back at Easter, that something would die and then come back together and emerge from this cocoon, from this tomb, if you will. I have never looked at this the same since learning that this is what happens. Now, instead of thinking about transformation as a period of hibernation and then suddenly emerging beautiful and on top of the world, I now know that if we really want to change, we have to surrender everything. If we really want to come out something different, something miraculous, we have to fall apart completely. Now, this part feels really hard. Many of us, regardless of your age, have gone through some period of time where you felt like your life was falling apart. If you reflect back on those times, and maybe you're in one now, and hopefully this will give you some hope. But if you look back at other times in your life where things were falling apart, things felt like goo, like mush, like you weren't sure where your form was in the world. We tend to transform through those periods of time. We change. We are changed by the things that happen to us as much as we change others by leaning into that process. But it takes that surrender, and it's scary. It's terrifying. But that's why the image of the butterfly is so pertinent as a symbol of change. It has nothing to do with the cozy nap inside of a time capsule. It's about surrendering yourself to the darkness, disintegrating until there's nothing left of you. And only then can your soul put itself back together. Thank you.
Join with me in the circle of song, the young and the old, the weak and the strong, singing with one voice, though we may speak different tongues. In the circle of song we are one. Some sing of this land, the country of the earth. Some sing of this land, of the beauty of the earth. Some sing of this land, for all that it is worth. In the circle of song we are one. The ends of it one does the sacred ami, le jeune et moins jeune, le grand et petit, chante de ce voix à travers différence, dans ce cercle d'amis tous unis. Each of us feels the place where to our home. Each of us must walk the path and must be walk alone. And each of us will bear the fruit of the seeds that we have sown. In the circle of song we are one. Come join with me in the circle of song. Weak and the strong, sing with one voice, though we may speak different tongues. In the circle of song we are one. Join with me in the circle of song. Weak and the strong, sing with one voice, though we may speak different tongues. In the circle of song we are one. In the circle of song we are one.
Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving, it doesn't matter. Ours is not a caravan of despair. Come, even if you've broken your vows 1,000 times. Come, yet again, come. These words by Rumi have been adapted to music in our hymnal and lift up the radical hospitality our congregations strive to embody. Whoever you are, come, yet again, come. Now today, Ken brought us the full hymn, the rendition that Rumi wrote. But in our hymnal, as it's published, we don't sing the part about broken vows. And I have to wonder, why not? What was it about this line that made it difficult to adapt to music or unpalatable to our sense of how to be with one another? I often point to the full poem when talking about covenant, because it is nearly impossible to make promises and never break them, and absolutely impossible to bring over 200 people into a community together and never, not a single time, make a mistake. While there are rare circumstances that warrant asking a member of the community to leave, we primarily focus on coming back into covenant with one another. Ours is not a caravan of despair. Even if you've broken your vows 1,000 times, come. How do we embody this musical theology? Who is allowed here, and how are they welcomed? Do we bring people fully into the community, or do we choose not to engage until they are so uncomfortable that they leave? Today, I want to talk about radical hospitality. In essence, the takeaway is it's not enough to be accepting. It's not enough to make room for someone who is not like you when they show up at your door. That is not radical. To only accept someone's difference is to ask them to assimilate, to blend in. Rather than offering acceptance, we must offer affirmation. We must meet people where they are, not just making room for them to fit neatly into the spaces we've carved out, but to make room for what they bring. What can we learn? How can we examine our practices from a new point of view? Is there room for everybody at the table, or is seating limited to those who already speak our lingo, know how to dress, and know our songs? Radical hospitality is about making room, not when it's just convenient, but when we're called to do so. So, what does it mean to be a Unitarian Universalist called to hospitality? What or who is calling us? For some, it comes from recognizing the immediate need to intervene to stop impending environmental disasters. For others, it may come from God. For some, the call comes from a knot in our stomach when we see injustice, when we're faced with the worst that humans can do to one another. I've heard some UU ministers refer to the 7 principles as a way of being called to action, to hospitality, to justice work. This calling, wherever it comes from, is there. The question is, will we answer? So in the past few weeks, I've been polling people about radical hospitality. See, the first time I encountered the phrase, I wasn't sure I understood what it meant. What made some hospitality radical and other forms of hospitality average? In general, people agreed that what makes hospitality radical is when it's not easy to be hospitable or when there's some kind of associated risk. So I asked people on Facebook, how do you practice radical hospitality? What is it, and how is it different from regular hospitality? Some answered that it's giving when you have little to give. Others said it was putting trust in a stranger. My friend Robin, a liberal Christian, had this to say. Regular hospitality is opening your home to acquaintances who need a shoulder to cry on. It's keeping your heart open to see past people's foibles. It's working to share your life in such a way that you can work toward creating a better world. Radical hospitality is opening your home to a stranger. It's opening your heart to that which has been deemed unlovable. It's allowing your life to be totally disrupted because you are called to do so. There's that call again. How will we answer? One congregation I worked for in New York decided to lean into making room by starting an interfaith program called the Huntington Interfaith Homeless Initiative, or HI. This program provides winter shelter to the homeless, and it started there about 15 years ago in response to some tragic deaths in a nearby park. Some people with nowhere to go to get out of the bitter cold of New York had died in the night, and this congregation responded. There's no doubt in my mind they felt a call to act when faced with that tragedy in the community. And there's no doubt in my mind that it was inconvenient, that it felt risky, and yet here they are 15 years later, housing homeless winter after winter. Another person on my Facebook survey said that radical hospitality is not just letting the stranger join you, but you joining the stranger. This is a subtle but major difference. How do we join the stranger? How do we go from acceptance to affirmation? This is where curiosity comes in. Greeting the stranger with curiosity means getting to know who they are rather than talking about who we are. Often in our congregations, we greet people with an expectation to share with them what Unitarian Universalism is, what our congregation does, and maybe even what it is we do personally outside in the community. This approach to hospitality isn't a bad one. It's the mode of the greeter or the community member being the one to share information. This style of being the one with the information to give is hospitable. It's making space and sharing, and through that sharing is an extended invitation. However, if we adopt curiosity as our approach, we do that subtle shift from letting the stranger join us to us joining the stranger. Now our role, while still one of welcome, is about getting to know the other person. What brought you here today? What do you do for fun? Do you have any hobbies? All good questions to open a deeper and more meaningful exchange, where space has been made to affirm the gifts the newcomer brings with them to the community. This feels like a safe place to begin the practice of radical hospitality. My friend Joy uses this curiosity as a motivation to pick up hitchhikers. Now, this is not something I personally want to do. Practicing radical hospitality is going to look different for each of us. We each have to weigh the perceived risks, the inconvenience, and our emotional and physical abilities to see what way radical hospitality is going to manifest in our lives. In my search for more opinions and more examples of the radical nature of hospitality, I asked people to share a time they had received hospitality that was above and beyond any expectation. And I invite you to reflect on that now. A time when the hospitality you received felt radical, felt like more than you could expect. Oddly enough, someone listed being picked up when they were hitchhiking as one of the examples, evidence that Joy's hospitality is both needed and appreciated. But the story that really spoke to me was another from my friend Robin about her congregation. She tells me, one Sunday morning a couple of winters ago, our church organist was in her office before anyone else was in the building. And all of a sudden, a guy opened her always locked door and gave her quite a scare. Once over her shock, she talked to him a bit and found out that he'd snuck in during the week and had figured out how to dislodge the latch on the door so he could get in there to sleep at night and be safe. By then, another woman was in the kitchen preparing coffee. She found some rolls and peanut butter to feed him. He stayed through the church service, after which a man in the congregation spoke to him, finding out he was a homeless wanderer, just staying in town a few days until he found a place to stay. There was a small town. This was a small town. They had no shelter facilities for men. So the man in the congregation took the guy home, fed him, let him sleep there, and then drove him the next day to a city over and helped him find lodging. Now, another congregation was in the news a few years ago for a very similar incident. A homeless person had let themselves into the church in Palm Beach, Florida, and was eating cookies in the church kitchen. Now, unlike Robin's church, this congregation called the police and had the man arrested, pressing charges against him for stealing the food he had eaten. I suppose the perceived risk just felt too high. I wonder what we would do if surprised by a stranger in our building when we reopen. Would we feed them? Would we call the police? Would we be willing to be changed by radical hospitality? Now, hospitality is a word with a spiritual history. Hospital, hospice, hospitable, and hospitality, they all come from the same root word meaning generous, caring, sustaining. The first hospitals were housed in monasteries and open to strangers in need. The most famous of these was that of St. Benedict. Benedict created a rule book to live by called the Rule of Benedict, which is still used today by many monasteries. The foundation of the rule is listening. Benedict writes, "Listen with the ears of your heart." Now, one Sunday several years back at the congregation I became UU at in Arkansas, two men entered the building. They were dirty, dazed, and reeking of alcohol. Our religious educator at the time was a champion for underdogs and sympathetic to the plight of the disenfranchised. She and I both watched the foyer of congregants stare and the lay leaders start to whisper. This was right after the shooting in Knoxville, Tennessee, and UUs in the South were jumpy about strangers who did not look like they belonged. This religious educator made her way over to the men, shook their hands, and asked them if they'd like a cup of coffee. She sat with them during the service, right beside them. And this service happened to be a lay-led service that involved a call for people to come up to the pulpit to share a poem or a song that was meaningful to them. Now, these drunken men had barely been able to sit upright, but took notice of this and became fidgety. She asked one of them quietly if he would like to go up, and he nodded. She later confided in me that she thought, "Oh boy, here goes my job. I've just invited this stranger up to the pulpit who's clearly not well today." She also told me later that she knew if she let him go up alone, other members of the congregation might try to stop him. So at the very end, when he had finally stood to go and share, she stood with him. She put a hand gently on the back of his shoulders and walked him right up to the pulpit the way one might walk with a small child, protective, friendly. She stepped back and stood quietly next to him as though to shield him from interruption. And the man said he hadn't thought of this in years, but he remembered a song his mother sang to him as a child. He sang it and he wept. I don't remember the song. I remember it being something gospel. I remember the tension in the room as he sang. And still, several of us had noticed what really happened that morning. A way had been made for this man, a stranger, a drunk, someone who definitely didn't look like they belonged. A way had been made for him to have a spiritual experience. Our educator had midwifed the entire congregation into experiencing that it really can be okay to let anyone come in. Come, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving, come. In our religious homes, we try to be our best selves. Yet even here, we struggle when presented with something that surprises or frightens us. In our need for our own place of refuge from the world, sometimes we struggle in offering hospitality to those who disrupt the way we want Sunday morning to go. In a book by author Paul Boers, Never Call Them Jerks, Healthy Responses to Difficult Behaviors, Boers touches on the way religious community can struggle with the practice of hospitality. He writes about a story in which every Sunday in the worship house, there was a regular attender, someone who was a homeless man over 7.5 feet tall, and he would have loved to have led that service. But because he had mental problems and his skills were limited, and because the Roman Catholic Eucharist was a duly ordained priest presiding, he couldn't lead the service. But there was always this moment in which the celebrant was supposed to say the formulaic response, and this guy would shout it out before the officiant could do so. Now, how does a community committed to compassion and hospitality deal with such a problem? The gentleman who was shouting out, disrupting service, he wasn't mentally equipped for extended reasoning or careful conflict resolution. And yet this congregation gathered and thought of a solution. They met with the priest. They said, I know this is a job for the priest and this is how we do things in our liturgy, but we have someone here who has a need and they want to lead. They know the formulaic response. They know what happens next in worship, and they're right now being disruptive. Let's just give them the job. And so they did. They gave the guy the job, and he said proudly the response at the exact right time every Sunday in worship when they were doing the Eucharist. By shifting away from hierarchy, which is shifting away from the symptoms of white supremacy culture, they were able to open up, widen that circle, and make a way of hospitality for someone who might otherwise have been displaced from religious community to actually have a role and take pride in their leadership. And it strikes me again that it was curiosity that guided this, a group of individuals who were committed to being curious and open together to figure out how community could work. A way was made, affirmation, a joining with the stranger, an experience that can teach us all how to be with one another. I want to live my life like this, to live the theology of Rumi, to be radically hospitable, to be firmly footed in the work of the holy, which is common and often broken. I want to be part of a faith that says, come anyway, come in, come sit at the table, come join the community, come change us with your presence. Ours is no caravan of despair. Come yet again, come. And please join me in listening to hymn 16, "'Tis a Gift to be Simple."
Tis a gift to be simple, 'tis a gift to is a gift to come down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend we shan't be ashamed. To turn will be our delight, till by turning we come round right.
May we take this into our hearts and be transformed. That to be radically hospitable is to walk the road of the holy, the common and often broken, an ever-changing theology which requires us to be willing to surrender, to fall apart, and to transform anew. May we remember when we greet the stranger, not to put them in the place we think we've prepared, but instead to open and prepare the place that is needed. May it be so.